Hey guys, tonight we slip into the wind-swept grasslands of the 12th century steppe, where your feet crunch against frozen turf and your breath steams like smoke in the crisp night air. You're not in a city with neon lights or familiar comforts. You're in a world of yurts, horse herds, and rival clans whose loyalties shift faster than the clouds. In this place, a boy named Temüjin is born, and his childhood, full of hunger, fear, and fierce kinship, plants the first seeds of how he'll later think about family, love, and intimacy. And honestly, you probably won't survive this childhood yourself, unless you happen to have a secret stash of dried mare's milk hidden in your backpack. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are right now. It's always wild to see who else is listening in the middle of the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along beside young Temüjin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan. At this moment, he's not a conqueror, he's just a skinny kid with tangled hair and no real guarantee of a tomorrow. His father, Yesugei, is poisoned when Temüjin is around 9 years old, and the family is promptly abandoned by their clan. You can almost hear the whispers of betrayal, neighbors who once shared meals now leaving his mother, Hoelun, to fend for her children in the wilderness. This sudden plunge into desperation shapes Temüjin's early understanding of loyalty and survival. Imagine being a child who has to dig for roots, fish with crude spears, and watch over your siblings in a land where one bad winter could erase you. That scarcity doesn't exactly leave much room for romance, but it does carve into him the idea that intimacy and partnership must be as practical as they are emotional. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. In Mongol tradition, kids sometimes played with ankle bones of sheep as little toys. Think of it like prehistoric dice or marbles, except instead of being made in a factory, you just picked them out of dinner leftovers. If Temüjin had a toy chest, it was literally a pile of bones. Nothing says childhood like a future warlord rolling sheep ankles for fun. As Temüjin grows, he learns early lessons about trust and betrayal. He even kills his half-brother Bekta in a dispute over food, a shocking act that reveals both his desperation and his uncompromising streak. Historians still argue whether this was the moment that hardened him into a ruthless survivor, or simply a tragic necessity in a brutal landscape. You can decide for yourself whether he was cold-blooded or just trying to prevent his family from starving. But it wasn't all grim survival. You picture Temüjin as a teenager, forming bonds with boys his age, bonds that on the steppe could be as strong as blood. These Anda relationships, sworn brotherhoods, weren't just about hanging out. They were lifelong alliances sealed with rituals of loyalty. The most famous was with Jamuka, who started as his closest friend and later became his greatest rival. It's a reminder that in Temüjin's world, the line between affection and rivalry was as thin as horsehair. Even here, you catch glimpses of how Temüjin might later approach love and sex. Not as indulgence, but as strategy, survival, and alliance. His mother, Hoelun, had been kidnapped as a young woman, taken from her husband by Temüjin's father. That act of forced union gave birth to him, and the story was undoubtedly etched into his understanding of how power, intimacy, and violence were often tangled. It was a grim family story, the kind of thing whispered in the jar when the fire burned low. And yet, despite all this, Temüjin is still just a boy of the steppe. He learns to ride horses before he can walk properly. He tastes fermented mare's milk and probably makes a face the first time, just like you would. And he sleeps beneath endless stars. You can almost imagine him lying awake at night, hearing wolves in the distance, wondering if tomorrow will bring meat or hunger. There's also a softer detail here, though it hides under the harsher edges. Temüjin's mother, Hoelun, was fiercely protective, teaching him and his siblings to survive in isolation. Her devotion to family gave him a living example of loyalty and endurance, even when the rest of the world turned away. Later in life, his wives and children would be wrapped in that same kind of fierce, uncompromising loyalty, even if it sometimes looked possessive or controlling. One more fact for you to chew on. Step families often practiced levirate, marriage, where a widow would marry her late husband's brother to keep resources within the clan. This wasn't about romance, but survival. For a boy like Temüjin growing up surrounded by these customs, the lines between love, duty, and strategy blurred long before he ever thought about conquest. So here you are, standing in the chill of a Mongolian dawn, watching Temüjin's breath puff in the air as he shoulders responsibility well beyond his years. He doesn't yet know the empire waiting in his future, nor the countless stories people will tell about his passions and conquests of a very different sort. For now, he's just trying to get through another day without starving, learning in his bones that intimacy, like survival, will always be about strength, loyalty, and sometimes the willingness to take what you need. You keep walking beside Temüjin as he grows into a young man, and now the winds of the steppe carry whispers of marriage. This isn't about swiping right or awkward small talk at a cafe. It's about alliances, horses, and survival. His childhood is marked by hunger and betrayal, but as he comes of age, his family's fortunes begin to shift when a marriage prospect is arranged. Her name is Berthe, and she will become not just his wife, but the thread binding together the intimate and political sides of his life. The first time you picture Temüjin meeting Berthe, you can almost see the nervousness he probably tried to hide. Mongol courtship wasn't about flowers or playlists, but there was still a ritual weight to it. Berthe came from the Ongirat tribe, and this match offered more than affection. It promised Temüjin a lifeline. The union wasn't just romantic, it was strategic, tying him to a powerful family that could give him protection in a world where protection was always in short supply. And here's a mainstream fact to anchor you. In 1178, Temüjin married Berthe, and she would remain his primary wife throughout his life, even as countless concubines and political brides joined his orbit later. In Mongol custom, that distinction mattered. Berthe's sons were the ones who counted in succession. But don't imagine it as some cold chess move without feeling. Step marriages often included an actual ceremony in a decorated yurt, with symbolic gifts exchanged. You can almost hear the horses stamping outside, smell the roasted meat, and see the young couple sitting side by side while elders murmured blessings. For all its political weight, it was also the beginning of a very human bond. Your quirky tidbit tonight, Mongol wedding traditions sometimes involved gifting a sash or belt. In one legend, Berthe gave Temüjin a black sable coat as part of their marriage gifts. That coat later became Temüjin's golden ticket. He used it as a peace offering to a powerful Khan, who in turn supported his rise. Imagine handing your spouse a coat that essentially launches their world domination campaign, beats a blender from the registry. Historians still argue whether Temüjin truly loved Berthe in the way we think of modern romance, or whether their partnership was purely utilitarian. But the evidence hints at something deeper. Despite all the women who entered his life, Berthe remained his anchor. Her position was never threatened, her sons were always legitimate heirs, and he consistently treated her with a respect unusual in a culture that often sidelined wives once concubines entered the picture. You sense the beginnings of Temüjin's philosophy about intimacy here. For him, sex and marriage weren't frivolous. They were tools of survival, power, and stability. Berta wasn't just his wife. She was his political equal in many ways. Later, when she was kidnapped, Temüjin would risk everything to get her back, a sign of both affection and the political disaster her loss would have represented. But let's not skip too far ahead. Right now, you see young Temüjin returning from the marriage camp, newly bound to Berta. They ride together, cloaked against the chill, sharing a future neither can predict. You might even imagine him stealing a quiet smile toward her, not just because of duty, but because in a life that has already been so hard, she represents stability, partnership, and just maybe something close to love. One more cultural wrinkle worth noting: among steppe peoples, polygamy was common, but the first wife held a sacred, unshakable position. Berta wasn't just wife number one in a long list, she was the wife. In fact, the entire imperial line would be traced through her sons, while the children of concubines often played supporting or secondary roles. That hierarchy of intimacy says a lot about how Temüjin balanced indulgence with strategy. Picture the newlyweds inside a warm yurt that night. Smoke rises from the hearth, the felt walls creak softly with the wind, and a hush falls over the camp. Outside, life remains brutal and uncertain, but inside that circle, Temüjin feels a rare flicker of security. For a boy who once fought his brother over scraps, that's no small thing. And of course, here comes a little joke for you, because you know if this were a modern rom-com, the tagline would be, "She gave him a coat, he gave her an empire." Hollywood would eat it up. In the years ahead, this bond will be tested, twisted, and strengthened. But for now, you let yourself rest in the warmth of their union. Temüjin is no longer just a starving boy of the steppe. He's a man with a wife, a plan, and the first threads of a legacy that will stretch far beyond either of them. You stay close as Temüjin's story veers suddenly into crisis, because only months after his marriage to Berta, everything goes sideways. The newlyweds barely have time to settle into their rhythm when the Merkits, a rival tribe with a score to settle, come charging into their camp. The hoofbeats thunder across the steppe, the shouts cut through the cold air, and before Temüjin can mount a defense, Berta is taken. You can feel the shock in your chest. For Temüjin, this isn't just the theft of a wife, it's the theft of his honor, his alliance, his stability. Remember, his own mother, Welen, had once been kidnapped from her husband by Temüjin's father. It's like the cycle of trauma is repeating itself, and he's powerless in the moment to stop it. The Merkits sweep Berta away to be forced into marriage with another man, and Temüjin is left pacing the empty camp. For him, the loss is unbearable, and not only because of personal attachment. Without Berta, his carefully arranged alliance with her tribe crumbles, his legitimacy weakens, and whispers of humiliation spread like smoke across the steppe. Here's a solid historical fact. Temüjin didn't just stew in anger. He quickly rallied his allies, including his blood brother turned rival Jamuka and his father's old ally Togrul, also called Ong Khan. With their combined forces, he launched a rescue raid against the Merkits. In an era when wars could take years to mobilize, Temüjin acted with breathtaking speed. And here as your quirky tidbit, steppe raids were sometimes so fast and chaotic that people joked you could have a horse stolen while you were still holding its reins. Imagine fumbling with your car keys and watching your Toyota Corolla gallop away without you. That's how slippery and sudden life on the steppe could be. Historians still argue whether Berta's abduction and rescue was more about politics than passion. Was Temüjin acting out of devotion to his wife, or simply out of political necessity to salvage his honor. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but one thing is clear: his determination to reclaim her set the tone for how fiercely he would guard his family's position for the rest of his life. The raid succeeds. You ride with Temüjin's forces as they storm into Merkit territory, arrows singing through the air, smoke rising from burning camps. In the chaos, Berta is freed, returned to Temüjin's side. You can almost imagine the relief in that moment, though perhaps shadowed by silence, because the rescue doesn't erase the trauma of what happened. Berta had been gone for months, and shortly afterward, she gave birth to her first son, Yochi. And here's the thorny part. Temüjin accepted Yochi as his own, but doubts about the boy's paternity lingered for the rest of his life and into the reigns of his descendants. Yochi's brothers would later use those doubts to question his legitimacy as heir. You can almost hear the tension at family gatherings. Pass the mare's milk, oh, and by the way, are you really our brother? The situation highlights the uneasy balance between intimacy and politics in Temüjin's world. To refuse Yochi would have insulted Berta and fractured the family. To accept him meant risking whispers of doubt that could destabilize succession. Temüjin chose acceptance, but the shadow of that decision stretched long after. Yet through all this, Berta's role remained untouchable. Unlike many women of her time, she wasn't sidelined by scandal. Instead, Temüjin doubled down on her status as his chief wife. He kept her close, elevated her above all others, and made her sons the legitimate backbone of his dynasty. That loyalty, whether born of love, strategy, or both, became one of the defining features of his intimate life. Let's pause for a lighter aside, because you need a breather. Picture a medieval Mongolian rescue mission as a kind of action romance film. Temüjin, dramatic wind in his hair, gallops in slow motion, while Berta stands silhouetted against the firelight. Cue heroic music. If Netflix ever picks this up, you know they'll milk this storyline. But beneath the cinematic glow, the raw human truth lingers. Temüjin and Berta's marriage was tested early by violence, loss, and rumors, yet it endured. Their bond would ripple across history, shaping not just their family, but the very empire that would dominate half the known world. So, you settle into the thought that intimacy on the steppe wasn't soft candlelight and serenades. It was fire, raids, and survival. And through that chaos, Temüjin and Berta held fast to each other, carving out a fragile space of trust that would carry them through the storms still to come. You follow Temüjin as his world expands beyond the intimate circle of family. The rescue of Berta didn't just secure his marriage, it lit a fire under his ambition. Now, instead of thinking only about survival, he begins to think in terms of power. And on the steppe, power was measured in horses, allies, and, yes, in the women who cemented those alliances. The air feels sharper, the stakes higher. You watch Temüjin gather warriors, negotiate loyalties, and slowly stitch together what had once been a scattered patchwork of tribes. His charisma draws men to his side, but his rise is also greased by the way he rewards loyalty. Horses and plunder, yes, but also wives and daughters. Here's the historical anchor. As Temüjin rose, he often sealed alliances by giving women in marriage. This was not unusual on the steppe. It was standard practice. When one chieftain pledged loyalty, his reward might be a bride from Temüjin's growing household, or the assurance that his own daughters would marry into Temüjin's family. Marriage wasn't a private affair, it was a currency of statecraft. Your quirky tidbit for this section? Mongol raids sometimes ended with warriors scooping up captured women as part of the loot, but it wasn't always purely about pleasure. A captured bride could mean a lifetime of labor, more children for the tribe, and another strand in the web of alliances. Historians like to point out that in steppe culture, a woman might move through multiple marriages in her lifetime, not always by choice, but always as part of the survival logic of the nomadic life. And yes, historians still argue whether Temujin's rise was more about brilliant strategy or ruthless opportunism. Did he carefully design his system of alliances, or did he just grab opportunities as they appeared, with women as one of the tools in his arsenal? The debate is ongoing, but either way, the result is the same. Temujin's reputation as a leader who both commanded loyalty and rewarded it handsomely. You picture him in camp at night, sitting cross-legged on a felt rug inside his jur. Around him are trusted generals, men who once might have been enemies, now bound to him by marriage ties and promises. Outside, horses snort in the dark, warriors huddle around campfires, and the steppe hums with restless energy. Temujin speaks with a calm authority, reminding everyone that loyalty brings not just protection, but tangible rewards. Berta remains by his side through all this, her role never diminished. She sees other women enter the circle, concubines, secondary wives, daughters of allies, but her place as chief wife never falters. She's the one who helps manage the household, who oversees the sprawling family tent, who ensures order among the women of the court. You can imagine her steady gaze across the flickering fire, perhaps tolerating, perhaps quietly judging, the parade of new unions that orbit her husband. Here's where the personal and political blur again. For Temujin, sexual relationships were never just indulgence. Each new wife or concubine represented either a tightened bond with an ally or a reinforcement of his own dominance. To share his household with another tribe's daughter wasn't just personal. It was a sign to that tribe that they were now part of something larger. But don't let all this sound too dry and transactional. You can almost picture Temujin making jokes with his closest comrades about these marriages. Maybe he teases a fellow chieftain, "Don't worry, if my daughter nags, it just means she cares." Steppe humor was likely as sharp and biting as the wind itself. And here's a little levity for you. If Tinder had existed back then, Temujin wouldn't have swiped right. He'd have negotiated a 500-horse dowry and called it statecraft, romance, steppe style. Yet even with the jokes, the underlying intensity remains. Every alliance, every bride, every oath of loyalty is another thread woven into the net that will eventually catch all of Mongolia. And through this slow process, Temujin transforms from a man scrambling to rescue his wife into a warlord whose charisma and cunning ripple across the plains. You close your eyes and let the sounds of his camp wash over you, the clatter of horse gear, the murmur of soldiers, the low hum of voices inside the jur. It's not just a camp anymore, it's the seed of an empire. And in that empire, intimacy is never just private, it's always political, always part of the machinery of power. Temujin is building one marriage at a time. The campfire smoke curls upward, and you drift deeper into Temujin's world, noticing that as his influence spreads, so does the need for order. Armies are one thing. You can organize warriors with discipline and promises of plunder. But what about the private side of life? What about the messy, complicated realm of intimacy, jealousy, and inheritance? That's where Temujin's yasa, his great code of laws, comes in. You can almost hear the solemnity in his voice as he dictates rules that stretch far beyond the battlefield. The yasa covers everything from military discipline to theft to personal conduct. It's not like a dusty law book gathering cobwebs, it's more like a living GPS system for his empire, guiding every decision. And yes, even the bedroom gets a few directions from Genghis Khan. Here's your historical fact. The yasa explicitly forbade adultery. For all the tales of Temujin's vast harem, he did not tolerate unfaithfulness among his people. To cheat on your spouse was to disrupt the fragile order of family, loyalty, and inheritance, and the punishment was severe. Some sources say death, others say a brutal public shaming, but either way, you didn't want to be caught sneaking around. And here's your quirky tidbit. According to later chroniclers, the Yasa also forbade bathing in running water during thunderstorms for fear of angering water spirits. Imagine being told, don't commit adultery and also stay out of the river during lightning. Equal weight, same code. If nothing else, it shows how wide the net of these laws really was. Historians still argue whether the Yasa was truly a comprehensive, written code, or whether it was more of an evolving set of oral decrees. Some scholars believe we may never know exactly what it contained, since much of it was passed down by rumor and interpretation. Was it a rigid constitution or a flexible guideline? That's the debate. For Temüjin, though, the message was clear. Intimacy had to serve the stability of the empire, not disrupt it. His own household was a model of this principle. Berta remained the chief wife, her sons unquestioned as legitimate heirs, while his other wives and concubines were carefully slotted into the hierarchy. Their children had places of honor, but not at the expense of Berta's line. You can imagine the order inside his great tent, the Golden Ger. Each wife or concubine had her own space, her own responsibilities, and a clear understanding of where she stood. It wasn't chaos, it was a system. Like the Yasa itself, the arrangement turned potentially combustible relationships into a structure that worked, for him at least. Picture it. A soldier might come to camp gossiping about a dalliance gone wrong, and Temüjin could remind him sternly that the Yasa had no patience for such disorder. A commander might try to claim a concubine improperly, and the law would step in. The same way he enforced discipline on the battlefield, he enforced it in the intimate sphere. Of course, this isn't to say that human feelings didn't spill over the edges. Jealousies brewed, whispers traveled, and rivalries simmered within the Ger. But Temujin's insistence on rules kept the flames from devouring the structure. And here's a little modern joke for you. If Temüjin had written a dating guide, it would have been called the Yasa Rules. Swipe carefully or die. Practical, concise, with a very strong emphasis on consequences. What's fascinating here is how Temüjin balanced indulgence with restraint. He certainly enjoyed the privileges of his position, wives, concubines, alliances, but he also understood that unregulated desire could unravel everything. The Yasa was his way of saying pleasure is fine, but it must never outrank loyalty. As you drift with him across the wind-swept plains, you notice how his empire is becoming more than just a military machine. It's also a social experiment in holding chaos together. From soldiers in the field to women in the Ger, everyone knew the boundaries. And those boundaries were what allowed the Mongols to ride farther, fight harder, and trust that when they returned, their households wouldn't collapse into scandal. So you let the crackle of the campfire fade into the night, the horses settling nearby, and the quiet hum of the steppe pressing in. Somewhere, in a tent warmed by felt and fire, Temüjin lies beside Berta, his world expanding, but still rooted in rules that reached even into the most private corners of human life. You step into the soft glow of lamplight within Temüjin's Golden Ger, and suddenly the battlefield feels far away. Here, the air is warm with the smell of felt and wood smoke, the walls draped in embroidered hangings, and the hum of voices layered with the occasional clink of cups. This is not the chaotic sprawl of soldiers' tents. It is the heart of Genghis Khan's domestic world, where wives, concubines, and attendants move in a rhythm that's half ritual, half rivalry. Think of it as the empire's most delicate battlefield, No arrows fly here, but glances are sharp enough to wound. Historically, Temüjin's household was enormous. As his power grew, so did his harem, which included multiple wives, each with her own attendants and status. But don't imagine a pile of pillows and idle lounging. It was a structured world. Berta, the great wife, presided with authority, while the others occupied their own sections of the jur or maintained separate tents nearby. The organization was as intentional as his military ranks. Here's a straightforward fact. Each wife was given her own camp encampment and staff. When Temüjin traveled, he rotated between them, spending time with each in turn. The empire moved with him, and so did this careful domestic carousel. Now for your quirky tidbit, Mongol tents weren't just living spaces, they were portable palaces. One description tells of Temüjin's gur mounted on a cart pulled by 22 oxen. Imagine a mansion on wheels rumbling across the steppe, wives inside adjusting rugs while the entire thing creaked along like the world's first RV. Road trip, Khan style. Historians still argue whether Temüjin's harem functioned more like a courtly household or a political machine. Was it primarily a place of personal intimacy, or was it a rotating cabinet of alliances and family management? The truth is probably both. The daily routines may have looked like domestic life, but each marriage was also a treaty in disguise. Inside the gur, you see how ceremony shaped the flow of life. Meals were shared in a hierarchy, Berta first, then others in descending order. Children played at the fringes, their laughter echoing off the felt walls, while attendants shuffled in and out with bowls of steaming meat or fermented mare's milk. And when the Khan himself entered, conversations hushed, eyes lowered, until he chose which corner of the space to occupy. Yet amid this ritual order, you can sense undercurrents. Rivalries sparked between secondary wives, each eager to secure favor for her own sons. Berta, steady as stone, likely absorbed slights with a calm mask, though surely aware of the shifting glances. The harem was a web of alliances, and every gesture carried weight. Still, it wasn't all scheming. You can picture moments of softer life, women embroidering together, sharing stories, or laughing at a joke from one of the attendants, children tumbling over rugs, scattering sheep ankle bones used as toys. Even in this charged atmosphere, there were stretches of ordinary domestic warmth, just multiplied across the scale of an empire. Now here's a lighter aside to keep your eyelids drooping. If you think managing one group chat is hard, imagine being Temüjin trying to keep all his wives happy while rotating sleepovers across an empire. Forget, did you read my text? The man had to juggle. Which tent am I in tonight and whose mother is watching me disapprovingly? The structure of his harem reflected the structure of his rule. Clear ranks, clear rewards, clear punishments for anyone who disrupted order. Just as soldiers knew their place in a unit, so too did the wives and concubines of the Khan. This was not indulgence gone wild, it was a disciplined intimacy harnessed for empire building. But the harem was more than domestic politics. It was also the cradle of succession. Every child born here was a potential heir, every birth a political ripple across the empire. Berta's sons were legitimate, but the others mattered too, placed into command, married into tribes, or used as symbols of the Khan's far-reaching authority. So you linger in the golden ger, listening to the murmur of voices, the rustle of felt, the occasional burst of laughter. This is the other half of Temüjin's empire, not the clamor of battle, but the quieter power of family, ritual, and intimacy carefully organized into a system that mirrored the discipline of his armies. It is a reminder that even the mightiest conqueror had to navigate the delicate negotiations of household life. And in some ways, those negotiations, full of glances, rivalries, and whispered stories, were every bit as complex as the strategies that conquered kingdoms. The ger fades into the background, and you ride alongside Temüjin again, but this time you're not watching him take wives, you're watching him give away daughters. Strange as it may sound, in his world, daughters were as valuable as cavalry when it came to conquest. By marrying them into rival courts, he turned family into diplomacy, weaving kinship ties that bound even distant kingdoms to his empire. Here is the historical fact to ground you. Temüjin strategically married his daughters to rulers of allied or conquered tribes. These women didn't simply vanish into obscurity, they often became power brokers in their new homes, acting as the Khan's eyes and ears, and sometimes even ruling in their husband's absence. Picture it, a caravan laden with silks, horses and gifts moving out from the Khan's camp. At its center rides one of his daughters, cloaked against the wind, her face steady though her heart may churn. She knows this is no fairy tale romance. She's about to become the linchpin between her father's empire and the fragile loyalty of another tribe. And here's your quirky tidbit. While European princesses were often tucked away in castles, Mongol princesses could wield direct political authority. Some sources describe Temüjin's daughters managing entire regions, commanding troops, and even adjudicating disputes. Forget the damsel in distress stereotype. These women were closer to regional governors in fur-lined boots. Historians still argue whether Temüjin valued his daughters primarily as pawns or as trusted lieutenants. Did he see them as disposable tools of diplomacy, or did he genuinely trust their judgment and strength? The fact that several rose to prominence suggests he wasn't just shuffling them around like chess pieces. He recognized their capacity to lead. One famous example is his daughter Alakai Beki, married into the Ongirat. She reportedly ruled her husband's people with remarkable skill, reinforcing their loyalty to her father. Another, Checheyigan, married into the Onggud and became a vital link between the Mongols and that powerful tribe. Through these unions, Temüjin wasn't just keeping peace, he was planting branches of his family tree across the map. You can imagine camp gossip swirling around these arrangements, warriors muttering that the Khan never lost a daughter without gaining a loyal vassal in return, attendants whispering stories of princesses who held more sway than their husbands, maybe even a joke passed around the fire. If you marry the Khan's daughter, better rule well or she'll tell her dad. The humor masks the truth, though. These marriages were serious tools of empire. A daughter's wedding wasn't just a family event, it was a treaty in flesh and blood. And for Temüjin, this strategy was brilliant. By placing his daughters in key tribes, he ensured that loyalty to him wasn't just political, it was personal. Of course, not every story was smooth. Some marriages brought resentment, especially when conquered rulers felt humiliated at being tied to the Khan by marital bonds. Others led to tangled lines of succession, with children born of these unions claiming mixed heritages and sometimes stirring disputes. Still, Temüjin pressed forward, confident that this weaving of kinship would hold the empire together. His daughters carried his influence farther than his cavalry could ride. You might say he conquered with bows and arrows by day and with wedding feasts by night. Here's a lighter image for you. Imagine the Mongol version of a wedding registry. Instead of blenders or silverware, the list would read 200 horses, 50 yurts, and maybe a herd of camels if you're feeling generous. Practical, step-style gift-giving. Through these marriages, the Khan built something more enduring than temporary alliances. He created networks of loyalty that stretched across deserts, rivers, and mountains. And in the private chambers of those distant households, his daughters held sway, ensuring that the empire was never too far from a reminder of his reach. So you ride with one of those wedding caravans in your imagination, hearing the jingling of harness bells, the murmur of blessings, and the steady beat of hooves. Another daughter leaves home, carrying not only her own future, but the weight of her father's empire on her shoulders. And somewhere back in the Golden Ger, Temüjin rests easier, knowing that his bloodline now binds yet another tribe into the fabric of his rule. The night air thickens with smoke and whispers, because as Temüjin's empire grows, so too do the stories about his appetites. Around campfires and in conquered cities, tales bloom of the Khan's excess, rumors that he fathered so many children he could fill entire armies with his offspring. Some of these whispers carry kernels of truth, others are clearly exaggerations, stretched like hide across a drum. But once you lean in, you can't help but be drawn into the gossip. Here's your historical anchor. Chroniclers from Persia and China often wrote that Genghis Khan had countless wives and concubines, taken not only from alliances but also from conquered peoples. His intimate life became part of his legend, with some records claiming that he could summon women from across the empire into his ger. And now your quirky tidbit. One Persian historian recorded, with what sounds like both awe and disbelief, that the Khan had so many concubines he needed a separate palace just for them. Was it true, or just a colourful flourish? Hard to say, but the image of a giant felt city full of women tied to one man's reputation certainly stuck in the imagination of later generations. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect reality or exaggeration by outsiders who wanted to frame Genghis as both larger than life and slightly monstrous. Was he truly fathering children on an industrial scale? Or was his harem mostly symbolic, with many unions remaining political more than physical? The sources leave room for doubt. Around you, the campfires buzz with stories. Soldiers joke that every second child on the steppe must belong to the Khan. Captives whisper about the women carried off to his household, and foreign emissaries, dazzled by the sheer size of his camps, carry these rumors back to their own courts, where they expand with each retelling. Yet behind the gossip lies a kernel of pragmatic truth. Intimacy for Temüjin was part of conquest. Taking women from defeated tribes wasn't just indulgence, it was a demonstration of dominance, a way to fold those tribes into his bloodline. To lie with the Khan was to become part of his world, willingly or not. You can imagine the dynamics inside the harem. Berti steady at the center, secondary wives holding their own households, concubines from every corner of the empire learning to live side by side. Some may have been pawns, some reluctant captives, others perhaps ambitious women who saw advantage in closeness to power. In that mixture of stories, the truth of Temüjin's personal life is more complex than any single tale suggests. Still, the whispers of excess stuck because they fit the myth. A man who conquered half the world must also have conquered in the bedroom. At least, that's how the stories go. People love to inflate power until it spills into every corner of life, and Temüjin's sex life was no exception. And here's a modern-style joke for you. If Mongol gossip circles had a newsletter, the headline would read, "Khan seen with yet another bride, empire shocks, horse herds yawn." But beneath the laughter, you feel a subtle unease. These stories often blurred the line between fact and fantasy, between genuine unions and forced ones. For the conquered, being absorbed into the Khan's household could feel like both honor and humiliation. And for the empire, the sheer number of his offspring created future complications about succession, loyalty, and legitimacy. As you sit in the flicker of the fire, you realize how these rumors became a kind of myth-making. They transformed Temüjin from man to legend, not only the conqueror of cities, but of hearts, beds, and bloodlines. Whether or not every tale was true hardly mattered. The stories themselves amplified his aura. So you let the whispers float around you, half-truths wrapped in smoke, exaggerations drifting across the steppe. Somewhere, inside his golden gur, the Khan might be asleep beside Berta, or perhaps visiting another wife's tent, or perhaps not indulging at all that night. But in the minds of his people and his enemies, the myth of excess has already taken on a life of its own, one that no law code or denial could ever fully erase. The whispers of excess still swirl in your ears as dawn breaks over the steppe, but now you shift centuries forward in thought, because modern science has poked at those rumors with a DNA swab. The question looms, were all those gossiping soldiers and scandalized chroniclers actually onto something? Did Temüjin really leave a genetic mark so vast it still lingers today? Here's your historical fact to steady the scene. In 2003, a study of Y chromosome markers suggested that about 1 in 200 men alive today, roughly 16 million individuals, carry a genetic signature linked to a lineage that likely originated around Genghis Khan's time and region. That's not a family tree, that's a forest. And here, as your quirky tidbit, one cheeky commentator dubbed this finding the Genghis Khan effect. Imagine being so prolific that scientists hundreds of years later slap your name on a global genetic anomaly. Forget having a star named after you. The man may have his very own chromosome branch. Historians still argue whether the DNA evidence really proves it was Genghis himself, or whether it could have been one of his descendants or another powerful lineage in the same region. The genetic trail is strong, but it doesn't come with a little name tag saying, property of Temüjin. So while the theory is compelling, it's still debated in scholarly circles. But let's not get too lost in the science. Step back into the imagination of the camp. You can almost hear warriors joking that the Khan didn't just conquer lands, he conquered entire bloodlines. And you can see why such a myth fits so well. His empire spread across Eurasia, his harem was legendary, and his daughters married into dynasties. Even if every exaggeration wasn't true, the scale of his family's reach made the story believable. The fascinating thing about genetics is that it turns rumor into possibility. Those campfire jokes about every second child belonging to the Khan may have been half true in some regions. Imagine wandering across Central Asia and realizing that the friendly herdsman offering you a cup of mare's milk might, in some small way, be part of Temüjin's sprawling legacy. Of course, the DNA story also raises awkward questions. How many of those children were born from alliances and how many from coercion? To celebrate the genetic spread without acknowledging the darker side would be like admiring the shine of a sword without noticing its edge. The truth, as always, sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Here is where you might pause for a soft chuckle. If modern ancestry websites ever traced people back to Genghis Khan, the customer service line would crash. Congrats, you and 16 million others share the same ancestor. Please don't all try to claim a piece of Mongolia. But beyond the humor, the idea carries a certain weight. Temüjin's conquests reshaped landscapes, toppled dynasties, and built new ones. His intimate life, his wives, his daughters, his concubines, his rumored excesses, wasn't just private business. It was another vector of empire, spreading influence not only through law and war, but through blood. You let that thought settle. In the hush of the steppe, beneath endless stars, a man once lay beside his wives and lovers, perhaps unaware that centuries later his genetic shadow would still ripple across the world. Whether or not every rumor is true, whether or not the chromosome really belongs to him, the fact that we were still asking the question shows how deeply the myth and the man have fused together. So you close your eyes and picture the invisible legacy. Millions of tiny strands of DNA, scattered like seeds on the wind, tying people across continents back to one restless rider whose breath once fogged the cold Mongolian air. The stars above the steppe glitter like scattered beads, and beneath them you sense the true machinery of Temüjin's empire at work. Not just his armies, not just his marriages, but his sprawling, carefully managed household. For a man who commanded the loyalty of thousands, it's easy to forget that his daily life was also tethered to domestic rhythms, to wives, concubines, and children, all living under one wide, shifting roof of felt and politics. Here's the solid historical fact. Genghis Khan organized his family into a hierarchical household, with Berta remaining the principal wife, but other wives and consorts each given their own ger and servants. These women weren't merely sequestered, they maintained estates, supervised economic affairs, and had the authority to manage resources in his absence. And now, the quirky tidbit, Temüjin's ger was reportedly transported on a wheeled cart pulled by dozens of oxen, like a portable mansion creaking across the plains. Imagine the logistical nightmare of packing up a house-sized yurt every time the camp moved. Marie Kondo would faint on the spot. Historians still argue whether this sprawling domestic arrangement was a sign of indulgence or an efficient extension of governance. Was the Khan indulging his appetite for company, or was he building a web of household management that allowed him to delegate tasks to trusted women? Either way, the line between private life and public duty blurred constantly inside his camp. Step closer and you can almost hear the layers of activity. In one ger, women weaving felt. In another, accounts of livestock being tallied. Children run between tents, half princes, half unruly toddlers who just happen to have the world's most feared man as their father. Somewhere, Berta supervises, her calm presence keeping the whole machine balanced. The logistics boggle the mind. With multiple wives and their entourages, the camp must have felt like a small city. Servants cooking, herders tending vast flocks, attendants preparing gifts for visiting allies. Even intimacy itself was scheduled, according to some accounts, rotated among wives in a way that balanced fairness with politics. Talk about the world's most awkward appointment book. And here's a joke whispered among the guards. If you guard the Khan's ger, don't fall asleep, there's a new mother-in-law arriving every week. You picture the laughter carrying in the night, a pressure valve against the sheer scale of responsibility. This domestic world wasn't hidden from the empire, it was part of its foundation. Women of the household wielded real influence. When the Khan was away on campaign, his wives and daughters managed resources, arranged marriages, and sometimes even commanded troops. The ger, rolling across the plains, was both a home and a command center. But living inside that orbit wasn't easy. Rivalries surely simmered between households. Concubines taken from conquered peoples may have felt isolated, carrying both the burden of their past and the uncertainty of their future. Children from different mothers grew up together, but with clear hierarchies shaping their destinies. The camp buzzes with contradictions, tenderness and strategy, family and politics, love and obligation. Temüjin moved between these worlds like a horse crossing a river, carrying with him the weight of empire even in his most private spaces. Pause a moment and imagine the scene at dusk. The great wheeled ger standing at the center of camp, smoke curling from its chimney, the Khan stepping inside after a day of decisions that spanned continents. Inside it's warm, noisy, crowded, a microcosm of the empire he built. Children laugh, wives murmur, servants scurry. And somewhere in the chaos, the man who conquered half the known world settles onto cushions, just another player in the complicated symphony of his household. The wheeled ger rattles in memory as you drift toward another layer of Temüjin's life, one less talked about in taverns and textbooks, the influence of faith. Because even a man who could snap dynasties like twigs still moved through a world shaped by gods, shamans, monks, and mullahs. all whispering about what a man should and shouldn't do in love, in marriage, and in desire. Here's your grounding fact. The Mongols practiced Tengrism, a spiritual system centered on the eternal blue sky, long before Buddhism, Christianity, or Islam seeped into the empire. Shamans performed rituals for fertility, protection, and health, and Temüjin himself often consulted them before campaigns or decisions. These beliefs brushed against his personal life too, as fertility rituals were thought to ensure strong heirs. Now for the quirky tidbit, some sources claim Mongol shamans recommended burying placenta beneath horse stalls to give newborns the strength of a stallion. Imagine Genghis nodding gravely while someone insists, "Yes, sire, the kid will be tougher if we put the afterbirth under the hooves." It's a mix of tenderness and bizarre practicality. Historians still argue whether Genghis Khan leaned more toward shamanic traditions or whether he was genuinely swayed by Buddhism and Islam as he encountered them through conquest. Was his household bound more tightly by ritual taboos of the steppe, or did his wives and daughters bring in influences from other religions that altered his views on fidelity and restraint? The record leaves shadows more than clarity. Picture the Khan seated in his gur, a shaman muttering prayers, incense curling in the air. Perhaps he is told to abstain for a time, or to approach intimacy under the gaze of the eternal blue sky. Later, when he marries daughters into Muslim courts, he surely hears new rules about modesty and marriage contracts. When Buddhists bring him tales of karmic balance, another perspective joins the mix. His sex life, far from being unmoored indulgence, exists at the crossroads of competing spiritual demands. Imagine the quiet tension in his camp. One wife raised with Buddhist stories, another carrying Muslim customs, Berta rooted in steppe traditions. Each brings expectations and each shapes the Khan in small, invisible ways. In some moments, desire might bow to ritual. In others, ritual might be politely ignored. It's a constant negotiation, not unlike diplomacy between states. And here's a lighter side for you. If you've ever argued over which Netflix show to watch, picture that multiplied by 3 religions, 5 shamans, and the destiny of an empire. The gur must have felt like the world's busiest committee meeting. Yet, through this swirl, one truth emerges. Temüjin's intimate life wasn't just personal, it was spiritual and political all at once. Fertility meant heirs, heirs meant stability, and stability meant empire. Every ritual, every blessing, every whispered prayer over a newborn was also a prayer for the Mongol state. Even restraint had its place. Sources hint that he observed periods of abstinence before major campaigns, a kind of ritual purification. Whether that was superstition or discipline, it shaped the rhythm of his household, reminding everyone that even the Khan's desires bowed occasionally to higher powers. The gur grows quiet in your mind's eye. A shaman sprinkles mare's milk as offering. A Buddhist envoy lights a butter lamp. A Muslim recites a verse. All of them in their own way frame how a man of flesh and bone, a husband and lover, fits into a universe brimming with sky, spirits and gods. And you realize that even the most powerful of conquerors never really escapes the invisible hands of belief. The incense smoke from shamans and the whispers of imams still linger in your head as you move closer to the crackling fire at the edge of the camp. Because while religion wrapped Genghis Khan's private life in ritual, gossip wrapped it in laughter. Soldiers huddled at night told stories, some true, some wildly embroidered, until his reputation in the bedroom galloped as far as his cavalry. Here is the historical fact to steady you. Medieval chroniclers like Giovanni and Rashid al-Din recorded tales of Genghis Khan's vigor and the vast number of his children, though often with exaggeration. These accounts became part of the empire's lore, repeated by friends and enemies alike. Now, the quirky tidbit. Mongol soldiers were said to joke that every woman captured in battle risked becoming a relative of the great Khan. Imagine that as a punchline passed around with fermented mare's milk, half smirk, half nervous truth. Historians still argue whether these bawdy stories reflect reality or whether they were propaganda, inflating the Khan's reputation to awe allies and intimidate enemies. Did Temüjin truly live up to the ribald legends, or were his soldiers just spinning campfire tales to make their leader seem superhuman? The answer flickers like firelight, bright but shifting. Lean in, and you hear the tone of these tales, not whispered reverence, but roaring laughter. One soldier brags he saw the Khan leave 3 tents in one night. Another swears he heard of a princess who fainted from the Khan's attention. Someone adds a detail so ridiculous you know it's fantasy, but everyone howls anyway. This isn't just entertainment, it's myth-making. The soldiers' jokes weave a persona bigger than reality. Genghis the unstoppable, Genghis the inexhaustible, Genghis who conquers battlefields and bedrooms alike. In a way, gossip was another weapon. An enemy might fear facing a man whose power supposedly knew no limits. You chuckle softly yourself. Because really, every empire has its camp comedians. The Romans joked about Caesar's baldness, medieval knights swapped innuendo about Richard the Lionheart, and Mongol warriors, exhausted from endless campaigns, told tall tales about their Khan's alleged prowess. History isn't just treaties and battles, it's also punchlines. And yet underneath the laughter, a serious note hums. These stories reflect the blurred lines between conquest and intimacy in a world where women often had little choice. To laugh at the myth is easy, to sit with the human cost is harder. Still, the gossip survives because soldiers need laughter, like horses need hay. Picture it clearly, the night is freezing, stars prickle above, and men sit around low fires, cloaks wrapped tight, boots steaming. One nudges another and says, if the Khan has this many sons, why are we still guarding the camp instead of inheriting? Roars of laughter follow, and the cold seems a little less sharp. The next day, rumors ripple outward. Merchants hear them, envoys repeat them, chroniclers jot them down. A joke told at a fire becomes a fact in a distant court, and centuries later you're sitting here wondering if there's truth buried beneath the smoke. In that way, gossip becomes legacy, not through accuracy, but through persistence. The laughter of those long-dead soldiers still echoes, shaping how we picture Genghis Khan, not only as a warlord, but as a man whose private life was spun into folklore. And as you lean back from the fire, letting the sparks fade into the sky, you realize that sometimes history is less about what happened and more about the stories people needed to tell to survive the night. The campfire smoke fades, but the laughter about the Khan, seen bedroom campaigns, lingers in the air as you wander deeper into the legacy he left behind, not just in the songs and jokes of soldiers, but in bloodlines stretching across continents. Because when people talk about Genghis Khan's sex life, they almost always circle back to one staggering idea, that he fathered so many children his descendants today number in the millions. Here is your anchoring fact. A 2003 genetic study found a particular Y chromosome lineage present in roughly 8% of men across a vast swath of Asia, stretching from the Caspian to the Pacific. That lineage is widely believed to trace back to Genghis Khan and his immediate male descendants, making it one of the most successful genetic signatures in human history. And now for the quirky tidbit. In Mongolia, there are families today who half-jokingly, half-seriously claim direct descent from the Khan, using it as a brag in everything from weddings to pub arguments. Imagine someone muttering, well, you know, great-granddad was Genghis, right before they lose at karaoke. Historians still argue whether this genetic spread was due solely to Genghis himself or whether it reflects the combined offspring of his male relatives and successors. Was the great Khan uniquely prolific, or was it the Mongol aristocracy as a whole that stamped its DNA across Eurasia? Scholars debate, and the truth is likely smeared across both possibilities. You picture the scale: hundreds of wives and concubines across conquered lands, marriages arranged for political leverage, children born in camps and cities alike. These offspring didn't just inherit genes, they carried fragments of policy, strategy, and imperial ambition. A son might govern a conquered region, a grandson might lead troops, a daughter, married strategically, might carry Mongol influence into a rival dynasty. And you can almost hear the logistical nightmare of family reunions. So whose turn is it to host this year? Oh right, every settlement between Samarkand and Beijing. One wonders if even Temüjin himself could have kept the family tree straight. But beyond the jokes, the implications are serious. The empire was, in many ways, a family business. His sons by Berte, Yochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui each carved out key roles, with Ogedei eventually becoming the great Khan. Daughters married into powerful clans, extending Mongol influence into Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. In this sense, every child was not just flesh and blood, but also a political tool. You imagine the scene of a young son being taught to ride, not only to master horses, but to inherit the burden of empire. Or a daughter leaving the family camp, cloaked in ceremony, bound for a marriage that would bind two clans. Each carried the Khan's legacy forward, whether through bloodlines or through governance. There's something almost unsettling about the scope. A single man, through strategic intimacy and ruthless expansion, leaves behind an imprint that shapes not only genetics, but the politics of continents. The joke at the campfire about becoming relatives of the Khan wasn't entirely off. In a sense, much of Eurasia did. And here is your third laugh of the night. If Genghis Khan had a dating profile today, it might simply read, "Looking for long-term empire building, must love horses, open to large family." Swipe right at your own risk. The empire's survival after his death hinged on this enormous family web. Cousins, uncles, brothers, all maneuvering for power. Inheritance disputes, rivalries, betrayals, all the drama of a reality show, except the prize wasn't a rose, it was half the known world. As you lean back, you sense how this sprawling genetic and familial legacy keeps the Khan alive even now. His DNA may hum quietly in millions of living men, while his family's choices continue to ripple in history books. And in the hush between heartbeats, you wonder whether that was his true conquest. Not the cities burned, not the armies broken, but the invisible threads of kinship stretching endlessly forward. The web of sons, daughters, and endless kin fades into the dark, and now you find yourself drawn to the shadowy edge of Genghis Khan's story. The one part no soldier-esque joke or shaman-esque prayer could quite illuminate. His death. And with it, the secrets whispered of lovers, mourning, and mysteries buried deep in the steppe soil. Here's the solid fact. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during a campaign against the Western Xia dynasty in northwestern China. The official records say little about how it happened, only that he passed during the campaign and ordered his burial to remain secret. And now the quirky tidbit. According to one legend, his funeral escorts slaughtered everyone they encountered along the route to keep the burial site hidden. Some versions even say a river was diverted over the tomb, as if the Khan needed a hydraulic security system to guard his rest. Imagine the modern equivalent, burying someone under a diverted highway just to be extra sure no one snoops. Historians still argue whether Genghis died from falling off his horse, succumbing to illness, or from wounds sustained in battle. Some fringe tales even claim he was killed by a captured princess, who, shall we say, turned intimacy into assassination. Was his final breath drawn in a warrior's bed or in a dusty battlefield tent? The truth dissolves into myth. Picture him in those last days, older, scarred, carrying the weight of an empire, perhaps surrounded by wives and concubines who tended to him, perhaps alone in a guarded tent with only the sound of hooves outside. Did Berta, his lifelong partner, stand beside him, or had she already faded from his world? We don't know. And maybe that's why the silence around his death feels louder than any legend. What's clear is that secrecy ruled. His body was whisked away, hidden in a grave whose location remains unknown. No grand mausoleum, no golden pyramid, just earth, sky, and anonymity. For a man whose conquest spanned continents, his end was wrapped in silence. And yet, even here, whispers about his sex life seep in. Some chronicles hint that he fathered children right up until his final campaigns, as if death itself couldn't keep him from adding to his lineage. Others murmur of concubines buried alive to serve him in the afterlife, a chilling echo of older nomadic burial customs. Whether true or exaggerated, the rumors reflect the same fascination, that his desires, like his empire, stretched beyond the ordinary. You can almost see the mourners, silent, faces hidden in furs, as the procession disappears into the mountains. The steppe wind swallows the tracks. Somewhere in that hidden place a great conqueror lies, his final secrets locked beneath earth that no archaeologist has yet disturbed. And here's your weary smile. If Netflix ever did a series finale on Genghis, it would end with a wide shot of empty grasslands, dramatic music, and a subtitle, Grave, Still Missing. Stay tuned. His deathbed, his burial, and the rumors of lovers who may have joined him in that last silence, all of it turns him from man to myth. A reminder that while armies crumble and empires splinter, stories, especially the juicy ones, can live forever. The wind over the empty grasslands carries you forward, past the silence of Genghis Khan's hidden grave, into the afterlife of his reputation. Because while his bones vanished into secrecy, his sex life did not. Instead, it mushroomed into legend, mutating into memes, folktales, and scholarly debates that still ripple today. Here's your grounding fact. In modern history classes and biographies, Genghis Khan is remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a man whose family strategies, marriages, offspring, alliances, were integral to building the largest contiguous empire in history. His personal life cannot be separated from his political life. And the quirky tidbit. In 2016, British tabloids ran stories about the world's most successful lover, claiming Genghis fathered so many children that 1 in every 200 men alive today might be his descendant. They treated it half like science, half like clickbait, and all like a weird brag. Imagine swiping through Tinder and realizing 1 in 200 profiles could be your cousin thanks to him. Historians still argue whether the meme of Genghis as a hyper-prolific lover is a distortion. Some suggest the narrative oversimplifies the brutal realities of conquest, turning coercion and politics into a playful, fun fact. Others argue that emphasizing his bedroom legacy distracts from his other, equally seismic impacts: trade networks, religious tolerance, and systems of law. Yet the fascination persists. In pop culture, Genghis appears as a caricature of male excess, a shorthand for unstoppable virility. Jokes float online comparing him to fictional playboys. Documentaries can't resist the DNA study. Even in Mongolia, his image oscillates between sacred national founder and meme-worthy ancestor. Picture this: a Mongolian teenager in Ulaanbaatar scrolling TikTok, laughing at a skit about Genghis' family tree that needs Google Maps, while outside their window, statues of the Khan Tower in solemn bronze. It's reverence and ridicule all in one breath. And maybe that's the point. Myths of sex, power, and lineage have always outlasted the dust of battle. Cleopatra, Henry VIII, Casanova. History loves to remember rulers by their lovers as much as their laws. Genghis Khan, with his vast empire and even vaster reputation, fits neatly into that pantheon. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes: soldiers chuckling at campfires, chroniclers scribbling scandalous margins, geneticists debating over chromosomes, and internet comedians dropping one-liners. The conversation never really stopped, it just changed languages and formats. And so, as the story of his sex life fades into the soft dark of your imagination, you realize that the fascination isn't really about numbers or partners. It's about how one man's private life became part of global folklore, stitched into DNA, gossip, and memes alike. Now, your journey with Genghis slows. The hooves grow distant. The tents collapse quietly into history. And you, listener, are left with a curious mix of fact and fable, laughter and sorrow, myth and memory. And now, as the story drifts into silence, let's soften the edges together. The fires are out. The horses are sleeping, tails flicking gently under the stars. That endless steppe, which earlier seemed so fierce and boundless, now feels calm, like a blanket stretched across the earth. You can still sense him somewhere in the distance, the great Khan, the conqueror, the father, the myth. But his footsteps grow faint, absorbed by the grass. Whatever truths or exaggerations surrounded his private life, they dissolve tonight into something quieter, less urgent. The gossip, the DNA debates, the jokes, told over mugs of fermented milk, all of it becomes just another layer of the long human story. Take a slow breath here. Notice how it feels to imagine history not as a loud lecture, but as a soft hum, a shared bedtime secret passed from voice to ear. The Mongol tents fade, the scholars close their books, and even the campfire comedians run out of punchlines. All that remains is the hush of wind over grass and the steady rhythm of your own breathing. You are safe, you are resting, and the weight of centuries slips away like smoke rising into a starry night. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the story settle like dust finally sinking after a galloping army passes by. The empire is gone, the myths are fading, and you, right here, can simply drift, letting sleep carry you gently where it will. Good night.